Good afternoon. There's a downpouring outside, so we not to make sure we also have people on Zoom, and we should start on time. Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you who made it here in the room, and to those who are connected via Zoom. I'm Francesca Trivellato. I'm a professor in the School of Historical Studies here at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I have the great privilege of introducing today's speaker. I also bring you the good wishes of our new director, Professor David Nuremberg, who 2 months ago generously interrupted his sabbatical to start his term in advance of the previously planned July 1st date, but who unfortunately had a prior commitment that prevents him from being here this afternoon. Today's lecture is made possible by the generosity of the Dr. S.T. Lee Fund for Historical Studies, which supports an annual lecture and workshop. And we are delighted to resume this series after 2 years of pandemic hiatus and have our dedicated staff to thank for tending to a great many details and ensuring that we could host you in a hybrid mode. At the end of the talk, there will be time for a few questions, and I ask those of you on Zoom to please type your questions in the chat. Professor Mariana Mazzucato is one of the world's leading voices, both in academia and in public policy circles. She is professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she founded the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is also no stranger to Princeton, where her family moved when she was a child, and we are delighted that her father, Ernesto Mazzucato, can be here with us in the room today. After graduating from Tufts, Mazzucato earned her PhD in economics from the New School of Historical Research, which is one of the very few institutions in North America where non-mainstream economic theory and the history of economic thought are still studied and taught. She is a recipient of many distinguished honors and awards, too numerous for me to list them all. I will only mention the 2018 Leontiev Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought and the 2020 John von Neumann's Award given by the Laszlo College of Advanced Studies in Budapest to an outstanding scholar in the exact social sciences. She is a fellow in the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK and of the Accademia dei Lincei in Italy. Her talk today builds on her latest book, Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, which appeared last year. But I would like to encourage you all to read her previous 2 books as well. The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, which appeared in 2013, and The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, 2018. Mazzucato is the rare economist with a knack for distilling complex ideas into accessible prose. Through amply documented examples and real-minded arguments, she leaves no doubt that the free market is a theoretical abstraction and a political slogan. She shows how many of the inventions that have changed our lives, the GPS, the internet, Siri, as well as many advances in medicine, would not exist were it not for long-term investments made by government agencies. And she reminds us that seemingly neutral metrics, such as the gross domestic product, in fact conceal deliberate choices about what to measure and the consequences that these decisions have for allocating our tax money. Moving from analysis to policy, she outlines concrete plans for new forms of partnerships between private and public sectors that she argues could produce stronger economic growth and more equitable distributions. In short, her publicly engaged scholarship is premised on an analysis of the history of her discipline and fueled by the imagining of possible alternatives to the present as we know it. We are delighted that she has agreed to speak here today, and please join me in welcoming Mariana Mazzucato to the Institute.
Jessica. I was getting worried because you were advancing my slides.
Did I? Ooh, okay, I was pressing something. Did I realize?
It's okay. Thank you so much for coming, also because it's pouring outside. And I was just saying that I wish I had invited my high school friends because most of them were still here. And I was just talking to my dad today. I did all my education in the Princeton educational system, even before they had, sorry, I did pre-K, apparently my dad was telling me, pre-K, K, then elementary school, middle school, high school. So I have a lot of friends in Princeton, but I forgot to tell them that I was talking. So if you can quickly put the news out, they might come by the end of this. Anyway, it's great you're all here. And I'm very happy to be talking about this theme of directed growth because I think we need it more than ever. The whole Build Back Better agenda, which I think should be called Build Forwards Better, but anyway, needs a framing. It needs a framing that explicitly talks about the direction of growth, not just the rate of growth. And yet so much of the narrative, at least within economics, is very much about growth, kind of for growth's sake. And when we do think about things that need to get done, whether it's around health, the environment, and so on, it actually isn't in terms of actually rethinking how we understand the economy and the economic modeling itself. So unfortunately, we have kind of like the hardcore economists or ministers of finance in one room, and then the people actually caring about the problems on the ground in another room. And a lot of my work actually tries to bring these two rooms together in terms of thinking of the new economic theory we require, so the new political economy, if we actually care about problem solving. And that's basically what I mean by a mission-oriented approach. And of course, okay, this is a slide you saw advancing. This is all in the context right now of a human tragedy around the world, because we're still, of course, in the middle of this pandemic, where we just realize how bad we are globally in solving problems. Just think, I hope you can hear me amongst all this like rain. Is that good? Otherwise, the tech guy can actually turn on the mic because apparently the acoustics here are so good, the mic's not even on. Other mics are. So the pandemic has shown us in terms of problem solving that we failed miserably. Just think back to the March 2020 when we finally all learned what COVID was, even though it had been around for a while. We failed miserably in just doing pretty basic stuff, right? It wasn't yet time for the vaccine, but the personal protection equipment, PPE, was not delivered to the front line. So these so-called essential workers, who we called essential, we didn't treat them very essentially, not only because we didn't manage to pay them properly or fund the social infrastructure properly in the years before, but they also didn't actually receive that personal protection equipment on time, hence a lot of the deaths on the front line. We failed miserably in terms of the test and trace system, which in many countries, we realized we didn't even have the ability to govern it. So in the UK, where I live, we somehow decided to outsource test and trace to Deloitte, one of the large consulting companies. And last time I checked, that's not exactly their expertise. We failed miserably around the digital divide. So as students were in lockdown, and in some parts of the world, they still are, they stopped having access to their human right to education because of lack of accessibility to digital technology. And the vaccine, we've got something like 8 of them, but that's not the mission. That's not the goal. The goal is to vaccinate everybody in the world. And currently we have what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, who I work very closely with through a council I run called the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All. He calls this problem vaccine apartheid, where something like 80% of the vaccines continue to be hoarded by 10% of countries. And the way we're actually innovating around the vaccine, unfortunately, has not actually been governed with common good kind of metrics. So we continue to basically allow the patent system, intellectual property rights to be abused. This is something I'll come back to later in the talk, but we can't solve the vaccination problem just through philanthropy and solidarity, sending vaccines from one part of the world to another. Vaccines actually need to be manufactured everywhere in the world. and it needs to go into people's arms. And unless there's that local capacity, it doesn't happen. Anyway, I could go on and on in terms of how this particular moment of COVID-19 should have woken us up to how bad we are at actually directing our economy towards helping to solve big problems. But we don't really need COVID-19 to remind us. Of course, we have the climate crisis, which people like Greta Thunberg and all the Fridays for the Future movement of teenagers around the world remind us that we need to stop blah, blah, blahing, a new verb. In other words, we talk a lot about sustainability, we talk a lot about global warming, but we're not actually acting. If your house is on fire, Greta says, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I stay? Should I go? You get out quickly. And the IPCC report that just came out, another report in recent weeks, just reminds us we have very, very few years left until this problem is irreversible. And I want to thank my father, who is here, for dedicating his entire life to nuclear fusion, which is probably one of the few, real solutions that we can have to systemically solve this problem. But of course, there's different types of technologies that require funding. And unfortunately, if you look at the actual funding, we still are not actually funding the transition as quickly as we should. Not only that, we actually are continuing to subsidize fossil fuel industries. So even though we talk about climate, and even during the COVID-19 recovery funding period, in many countries, that recovery funding actually continued to go to fossil fuel projects. You can see that here, 56% of the COVID-19 recovery funding allocated to energy companies in the G20 countries went to fossil fuel projects, 151 billion during the COVID-19 recovery. This is hardly putting our, walking the talk. And so what my work has tried to do is to say, come on, we can't just keep going from crisis to crisis to crisis, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the global pandemic crisis, and we're gonna have more of those. Apparently, as the permafrost melts, lots of new viruses will come out. What does it actually mean to have a proactive approach to this problem and to actually confront these crises in the way that we actually design our thinking about how to shape and co-create a very different type of economy? And before I get to that, because that's what most of my talk will be about, that kind of framing that I think we need in order to be proactive and not reactive, to shape markets and not just to constantly fix them, as economists like to pretend the role of the state is, I just wanted to make sure we're all depressed enough in case I didn't depress you. So before getting to the positive bit, in terms of why we really need to go after the structural problems in the economy, as opposed to just addressing the symptoms of the dysfunctionalities. And for this, I think, given that this has been organized by Francesca and her team, who are historians, I do think it's really important to remember that the economy is not this like deterministic thing out there. The market is not a deterministic thing out there that puts pressures, market pressures on actors. The market itself is an outcome of decisions we make in all sorts of different organizations that together kind of make up the economy. And all those organizations in the public sphere, the private sphere, the civil society sphere, if you think of trade unions and how important they have been in the history of capitalism, we wouldn't have weekends, not bad, Saturday and Sunday. We got those from trade unions fighting for it. So all these different organizations, the decisions they make, how they're governed, but also their interrelationships determine actually the kind of market outcomes we end up with. And Karl Polanyi, a very famous historian who I'm sure most people in this room have read, in 1944 wrote this great book called The Great Transformation, which was very much telling that history of the market itself, not only debunking the notion of the free market, but actually showing that the notion of the free market was in some ways pushed into existence through the watch of a heavy-handed state. In other words, it was actually a state activity and a lot of policy and regulations that actually made the market mechanism itself happen. There was nothing natural or universalistic about it. And so in looking at the deep structural problems that we need to address instead of just the symptoms, I do think it's important to put our attention on those structural issues around those different agents in the economy. I'm going to give you a super whirlwind tour. This could be a 3-hour lecture just on this issue of markets. And and how to design them differently. But just to say, obviously, finance, the financial markets are hugely important, and modern day capitalism, and they are a huge part of the problem. You don't need me telling you that. We just went through in recent years a massive financial crisis, but we actually go through a lot of these financial crises one after another. And one of the big problems, at least in modern day capitalism, is that finance, broadly defined, in terms of also shadow banking and all the financial intermediary activities, have been basically financing themselves. And by that, I mean finance, insurance, and real estate. A lot of the recovery funding actually since the last financial crisis, so when money was created by central banks globally to basically save the capitalist system from falling apart, something like 80% of that went back to the financial sector. And this graph here, my dad said, stop showing graphs when you don't explain them. So I'm going to tell you what this graph says. This is from Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, who in actually starting to get worried within the Bank of England of the trends I just talked about, showed the blue line on the top is the growth of financial intermediation, broadly defined financial sector, basically everything but manufacturing and agriculture, as a percentage of, financial intermediation as a percentage of real gross value added compared to the rest of gross value added. And what you see is that it's been outpacing the rest of the economy. And as long as that sector was then going back into the economy, that would be fine. It would just be kind of greasing the wheels of commerce. Instead, as I just mentioned, there's lots of evidence that it's actually going into other parts of the financial sector. So for example, huge amounts of finance trying to help people buy stuff, right? Credit. So this is showing mortgage credit over the last 130 years in 14 advanced economies. And the problem is when you just flood the system with credit, making it easier to buy things, at the same time that people's real wages haven't necessarily increased, which is true in many OECD countries, you actually end up with a financial crisis. So the ratio of private debt, everyone always obsesses about public debt, private debt over disposable income is actually back today at the level it was just before the financial crisis. You'd think this is in the front pages of a lot of the papers, especially the FT. It's not. And this is, incredibly vulnerable problem in the system in terms of this bubble being able to burst quite easily. And if you look at the relationship between mortgage credit and real house prices, because you're just putting a lot of demand for those homes in the system, not necessarily producing more homes and especially accessible and affordable homes, this is the beginning of a new crisis. Now, if the problem was just finance, we could just complain about finance and Goldman Sachs and all the big bad banks. Unfortunately, what we also have is an ultra financialized real economy, right? Before I was kind of comparing finance and the real economy, businesses in pharmaceuticals and IT and energy are themselves ultra financialized. And what do I mean by that? If you just look at what's been happening to profits in the last decades, and profits, by the way, as a share of global income, because you can, is at a record level. Global income, like a global GDP, can be broken down in different ways: by product, national income and product accounting, by income, wages, profits, interest, and by demand, the usual way we look at it: consumption, investment, government spending, and net imports. And profits, which are at a record high as a percentage of the total global income, labor is actually today at a record low. These profits are not actually getting reinvested back into the economy. That's what I mean by a financialized form of business. We have a very high percentage of these profits going into things like share buybacks, where you have large companies just buying back their own shares to boost the stock prices, stock options, executive pay, because as you know, many executives get paid via stock options. And this table here from Bill Azonic's work just shows that kind of decreasing level of reinvestment back in, and an increasing level just going back to different types of shareholders. And so this idea that it's actually the right thing to do to boost your share prices because we want to maximize shareholder value is actually itself something that's quite recent. It really only started happening in the 1980s. Harvard Business School taught it as a great new formula for business through the work of people like Michael Jensen. But what you see also is that the ramifications of that, the implications of that, you see it also in terms of falling investment, coming back to GDP also being divided by the demand side, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This is the I, so business investment share of GDP. And of course, so this is what I wrote about in the book that Francesca talked about, the value of everything. If these profits are going just to boost stock prices and hence what large shareholders are getting, it's not a surprise that the percentage of cash flows returned to shareholders in the economy has been increasing. And of course, CEO to worker compensation ratio also, especially in kind of Anglo-Saxon economies, where companies are driven by just maximizing their shares. So finance is financing fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. Business is ultra financialized in terms of being very short-termist, just focused on maximizing short-term profits. But governments too, I'm not here to romanticize and glorify governments. Governments are very stuck themselves. I've dedicated a lot of my writings to this. And what I mean by governments being stuck is the framing, the way public organizations are governed are incredibly problematic. We have, on the one side, the kind of, in quotes, neoliberal, Reaganite, Thatcherite kind of view that governments, is part of the problem, get out of the way. But usually when we have adults in the room like yourselves, we don't talk about it that way. The problem is when we have adults in the room, and also even in progressive governments where we actually think we need government, we're stuck. We're stuck because at best, we talk about the role of government as fixing problems, fixing market failures. The idea that somehow the market is kind of the perfect way to organize our capitalist system, but sometimes it messes up. Then government has to come in and put patches, Band-Aids into the system. By definition, makes it, in my opinion, reactive. Coming back to my first point, we need a proactive, not a reactive way to think about policy. Well, it doesn't help if the way it's actually even framed in economic theory, which then of course is used to advise, again, ministers of finance, ministers of the economy, and so on around the world, has actually set it up to fail. It's like, it's too little, too late. So whether it's basic research and development funding that we need, and a lot of, I know, researchers here in the room today, that is justified in economic theory as fixing a positive externality problem. There's not enough private sector funding of basic R&D because the spillovers are so wide. So you need the government to come in and fix that problem by funding some basic R&D. Public goods, clean water, defense systems. It's seen as a correction for something that someone else is not doing. The opposite would be negative externalities. If business is doing too much of something bad, then government has to come in and try to get them to do a bit less of that through something like a carbon tax. Or due to information asymmetry, another type of market failure that economists talk about, you might not have enough funding for small, medium enterprises, so government comes in and patches that up too. So my point is not that these market failures don't exist. They definitely exist, and we need more basic research and development. We definitely need carbon taxes and so on. But if the framing is just about fixing a problem and patching things up, it's really hard to actually help really shape and create a better system. And as long as the system was perfect, then who cares? And then that would work fine. We could incrementally make it work a bit better. When it's failing in terms of climate change, in terms of inequality, in terms of health pandemics that reveal just how problematic our governance systems are, we need to actually have a very different governance system of our public institutions themselves. And what's interesting, and the reason that I actually set up a whole institute, which is actually a department in London at University College London, around some of these ideas, is that the training of civil servants, of bureaucrats around the world, has actually been fed by this kind of market fixing failure idea. And it's kind of trickled down through concepts of public choice theory and new public management, where these ideas that actually, government, is there again just to fix markets at best, but also that government failure is even worse than market failure in some ways because it might get captured and you have all sorts of, government failure possibilities along the way. Then this idea that actually government should import private sector strategies and try to also be as efficient as the private sector in order also to minimize certain types of inefficiencies in government, this idea that bureaucracies are always going to be kind of inertial and we need to bring private sector efficiency, cost benefit analysis, net present value calculations inside government was actually fed through very much the kind of training of the civil service itself. And so, one of my points is actually if we're going to move away from, at best, a patching up of the system, market failure, fixing, framing, well, then what should the new kind of education be of civil servants themselves to think about shaping and co-creating markets alongside other actors, as opposed to just bandaging things up and worried about corruption and bureaucracy along the way. And what was interesting actually is that this kind of ideological view of government, because I do think it's ideological, which then led to a lot of outsourcing, a lot of privatization in recent years, even from conservative politicians. This is a Tory lord, his name is Lord Agnew, in the UK government, has started to be seen as a problem. And this guy during COVID-19, again, he's a lord of the conservatives in the UK, said, my God, we have actually infantilized our public sector by this overuse of outsourcing contracts, because we kind of stopped believing in government administration as something also that needed to be funded, to be thinking out of the box, to be as cool as going to take an MBA, right, at Wharton, where people take really funky classes like strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. It's all about, rejuvenating the mature corporation. Well, when we see these bureaucracies being a bit slow, we just say, oh, it's just bureaucratic, it's just government, oh God, right? As opposed to rejuvenating our bureaucracies by actually investing within our public administrations and resisting some of that ideology coming from public choice theory. But it was interesting to me, at least, because I've been ranting about the problems of overly relying on consulting companies within governments, that it actually took something like Brexit and COVID-19 in the UK to reveal just how much money was going from government to the McKinseys and PwCs, because government had also kind of lost its capacity and had become infantilized. So in the book, I kind of looked through all sorts of different myths, just like I did also in The Entrepreneurial State, which Francesca mentioned. The Entrepreneurial State was all about kind of debunking public versus private sector myths. Everything that makes our iPhone smart and not stupid was actually funded by public institutions, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri. And yet we continue to talk about the role of government as, again, fixing or maybe regulating, redistributing, enabling, de-risking who? They're cool risk takers in the private sector, as opposed to really having even a theory of collective value creation by different types of actors, of course, in the private sector, but also the public sector, and asking what is the kind of different way to think about value in the system if we really believe that we need collective intelligence and all sorts of different value creating institutions. But these myths around value as though it's just happening in business, the myths around the market as though government is just there to fix the problems of an otherwise perfectly functioning Pareto optimal market, the myths around efficiency as though governments themselves need to be run with these kind of static efficiency metrics, the kind of lack of investment within our public organizations that we need to develop those dynamic capabilities to have creative bureaucracies, but also this idea that, the direction should actually be set by the market and government is just there to kind of set the, level the playing field along the way. And those myths are basically what I tried to debunk in my 3 different books, but I'm going to be focusing mainly today on the third one, which is much more, in some ways, positive. It's like, how do we go then beyond all these stuckness in finance and business and government, but especially what would a different approach look like that was truly proactive and admitted the fact that we actually need just as much ambition and creativity, dynamism, and inward investment in all the types of organizations that form the economy, but also seeing the economy itself as an outcome of that. So when we fail to actually ask these fundamental questions about governance, including inside the business sector, maximizing shares versus perhaps maximizing something much wider, like stakeholder value, what does that look like? What can we do, not just talk about, but actually do to make the system work better? And it's called mission economy because it really struck me that, when men, it was men at the time, now it's also women, thank God, went to the moon for the first time 51 years ago, there was none of that language about, fixing markets, at best fixing markets. It was much more bold. And in fact, the way Kennedy actually framed it was, we're going to do this because it's hard, not because it's easy. We don't talk about things like that today. We don't say we're going to fight global warming because it's hard, not because it's easy. It's going to require taking on difficulties. It's going to require experimentation. It's going to require trial and error and sandboxing. Yes, a lot of money, but it's not just the money, it's how we actually organize the system itself. And so what I do in the book, and I kind of use the Apollo program as a metaphor, but then say, and you know what, our problems today are much harder than just getting to the moon. We have wicked problems. The Sustainable Development Goals are wicked. They require behavioral change, regulatory change, social change, and of course, technological change. We're never going to get there with the current governance of businesses, the governance of government that we have. And so that kind of level of directionality, that, admission that this is actually going to require not just leveling the playing field, but actually tilting it and going in a particular direction. What does that mean? The fact that we actually need to embrace the difficulty, as Kennedy said, it's going to be hard, not easy. What does that mean to go beyond this idea of government as de-risking someone somewhere else? The idea that we actually need to rethink our bureaucracies. What does that look like? A redesign of the organizations within government. Looking at finance, money in an outcomes-oriented way, like we do, by the way, when we go to war. No one just says, oh, put a bit of money in there and hope for the best, right? We have outcomes-oriented budgeting in wartime. Why do we then just think that with our social problems, you can give a bit of money here and there and then, pray and hope that we solve them? And especially, and this is kind of the thing that I've become obsessed about, how do we actually design public-private partnerships so they are truly symbiotic, mutualistic, and not parasitic or predator-prey? In my world of policy wonknish, we talk about innovation ecosystems, but the word ecosystem, if you speak to any biologist, is not like a normative word, it's just like a thing. Then you're going to have to describe and have metrics of whether the ecosystem is parasitic, mutualistic, predatory, and so on. So what does a mutualistic public-private partnership look like? And again, in the early days of the Apollo program, they had no idea how to get there. So it truly was hard. It truly required lots of experimentation. And they finally ended up with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous way of getting there. But just the kind of, openness to doing, to experimenting and thinking through what would be the most creative, the kind of a better way to do something as hard as not only getting to the moon, but getting back, right? It wasn't just getting to the moon, getting back in a short amount of time. And they did fail. They did fail along the way. There was a lot of trial and error, learning by doing. This is one of the things about infantilization of government. You don't grow if you don't learn by doing, right? So this problem that Lord Agnew has talked about is huge. And so when NASA failed in different moments, but also in the Apollo 1 program, in the fatal day, when was it? January 27th, 1967, when those 3 famous astronauts died. What was interesting is, it's terrible to talk about a tragedy, it's interesting, but one of the astronauts, Gus Grissom, yelled, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear during the simulation what was being said to them in mission control room. So what did NASA do? They didn't just say, oh yeah, we're a bureaucracy, we suck, we're just very vertical and we don't, we work in departmental silos, which is what many governments do, right? They all have their departmental silos. We complain about governments as working in departmental silos. They changed their organization based on that. They brought in this guy, George Mueller from Bell Labs, to help NASA redesign itself with the famous way that we know that NASA's designed, with the project managers, each with their delegated team, but with constant communication flow between them. So knowledge going between departments, agile and flexible departments. That was seen as important because NASA was purpose-oriented. If you have a target, a really difficult target to reach in a short amount of time, you're going to have to actually have a dynamic, creative, agile, flexible organization. So these aren't just things in and of themselves. It's because you actually want to get the job done. And getting the job done was not just NASA. There was many different private sector companies, lots of different industries involved. The total amount of people apparently for the whole Apollo program was over 400,000 people, but lots of different sectors. It wasn't just aerospace, it was nutrition, materials, electronics, software. You might have seen the film Hidden Figures, which showed also a lot of African-American women doing a lot of the data science. They were actually called computers, but in some ways, the modern day software industry was a spillover of the moon landing itself, but lots of other spillovers from camera phones, foil blankets, home insulation, athletic shoes, diapers, lots of different types of spillovers across many, many different sectors. It wasn't just one sector, and it wasn't just directed by NASA. It was very much, well, it was directed by NASA, but it wasn't something that was just state-led, state-done, micromanaged. All those different companies that got involved, and there was many of them of different sizes, worked with NASA in a moment where I actually think government paid a lot more attention to the contracts. How do you actually have a direction of travel, really concrete target, but then leave open the how? Because of course, if you're just micromanaging everyone, telling them what to do, you also stifle innovation. So there's real attention to the detail, for example, of procurement policy, so government as purchaser, that needed itself to be redesigned away from the way they had been doing it through cost plus contracts towards fixed price, almost like a prize scheme, a challenge scheme, but very, well, again, open on the how, but also with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. That's just interesting that they actually paid attention to the kind of political economy of the design of the contracting itself. And what was also interesting was the boldness and the confidence that they had, because they knew they needed to work with all these different companies. And they put in a clause in the contracts of no excess profits, which is interesting, right? In excess of what? In excess of what you're actually doing, right? This is a massive collective enterprise, lots of different investment. And what does it look like to already in the contracts try to put in that idea of sharing both risks and rewards and not turning it into a gambling machine, which is actually what I think has happened in many sectors today, where you have a lot of public money going in. If you're not attentive to these issues, you might end up with an abusive system. I've written a lot about the healthcare area, where you have the NIH, for example, the National Institutes of Health, putting in over $40 billion every year in health innovation, very high risk. A lot of that fails, and somehow not managing to make sure in the contracts that the prices of the drugs that might come out of that public funding should at least take into account that the taxpayer help pay for it. So what's the right price of a drug that has been collectively invested in and is not just a Pfizer or AstraZeneca drug? What's the right way to govern the intellectual property rights in that system? Patents today, it's fine to have patents, but if they're too upstream in the innovation process, so the tools for research are being patented, if they're too wide, so patents are used for strategic reasons, just to keep out any kind of potential imitator, even far off. And if they're too strong, hard to license, that's not exactly the kind of governance of an intellectual property rights system, which reflects the fact that patents in the end are contracts given by the state to a private sector institution to earn monopoly profits for 20 years. So I'm just very interested in this issue of contracting. How can we get, really ambitious, mutualistic, symbiotic contracts which reflect that collective intelligence? And also the same guy actually who paid a lot of attention in NASA to procurement that I was talking about before, his name was Ernest Brackett. He also had this great quote I found in some of the secondary literature. He said, and if we stop investing in our own brain in NASA, we won't even know who to work with in the private sector. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. So he said, we have to be investing within our own capabilities. Otherwise, he said, we will get captured by brochuremanship, which I think is quite an interesting word, because they didn't have PowerPoints at the time. They had sexy brochures that a company might bring in to convince NASA to work with them. And yes, it did cost a lot of money, as Kennedy himself warned. He also warned it wasn't going to be as expensive at the time as they were spending on cigarettes and cigars. But what's interesting, really, if you look at the kind of multiplier effect, which economists are interested in, for every pound, euro, or dollar of public funding, how much does GDP actually get stimulated? It wasn't just public money, kind of helicopter money going into the system. It was very much the multiplicative effect that led to all those spillovers across all those different sectors I talked about before, actually happened very much as a result of these design challenges: intra-organizational design, inter-organizational design, and the tools themselves like procurement and so on, that really catalyze a lot of that innovation. So basically what I do in the second half of the book is to say, all right, well, interesting, none of that kind of language and way of even telling the story of what government is for is out there today. And so how are we ever going to, tackle some of these really deep problems, these 17 goals? The climate one is just one of them, SDG 13, but the 17 sustainable development goals that every country has signed up to, every country that put their signatures on them since 2015, how are we ever going to achieve these and the 169 targets beneath them unless we actually learn how to do things differently? And wouldn't it be interesting if we actually, paid attention to those issues of experimentation, trial and error, symbiotic partnerships, outcomes-oriented tools like procurement or budgeting, and so on, and really thinking of it as a collective investment process, but then we actually need an investment pathway, and talking about things like shared risk-taking, shared ways to benefit in terms of the rewards, and not just do what we often do, which is socialize the risks and privatize the rewards. And so I actually had the honor to then work, and sorry if this is going to get a bit practical, and I'll go through it quickly, but my own thinking then kind of evolved when I started to work with policymakers globally to put this into action. And one of the more interesting things I did was work with the European Commission around transforming their innovation policy, at least the challenge-oriented part of it, which was supposed to create a more inclusive, sustainable, smart Europe. So smart meaning more innovative, sustainable, greener, inclusive with less inequality. That wasn't happening in Europe, but they had this talk about it. So I said, why don't we transform this very broad chat, the blah, 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 about smart, inclusive, sustainable growth into kind of a mission-oriented, moonshot-oriented framing, like everything I just talked about. And so the idea was, let's begin with these grand challenges, the SDGs, or even just broad proclamations of sustainable growth, inclusive growth, and then think, what are examples of missions underneath those that would be as catalytic as the moon landing was in terms of bringing lots of different sectors together. So climate change is not just about renewable energy. It means changing all sorts of things like how we make steel, how we make cement, how we move, how what we eat. So an intersectoral approach to thinking of a moonshot, but also these little circles on the bottom are, then what do we do about all this like money that's out there through grants, loans, procurement that I mentioned before, bailouts during COVID-19 recovery funding, to truly catalyze that bottom-up experimentation as the Apollo program did. So whether it's clean oceans, SDG 14, turning it into something really concrete, like a plastic-free ocean, with getting 90% of the plastic out in a short amount of time. Lots of different sectors would obviously be part of that, and lots of different types of projects like reusable and biodegradable plastic substitutes. This one, by the way, I find interesting because I have 4 children. They all know about the plastic-free ocean mission because there was actually a documentary by David Attenborough, The Blue Planet, where that last episode just showed all these dolphins, sharks, and so on dying because they were choking on plastic. So there is something about also bringing in the cultural sector and not interpreting everything that I'm talking about as just science, hardcore STEM subjects. It is a bit about also cultural change and making these stories just really interesting, like those pictures of everyone looking up at the Apollo 11 on that day when they actually did get to the moon, just that how it inspired so many different people around the world. What does it mean to inspire also through the cultural sector and some of these more social missions? And in a second report, I tried to also kind of weave out, like, what does this then mean for financing, for agility, flexibility, the culture of the public service, literally the job descriptions we need to welcome risk-taking and making mistakes. Why are venture capitalists allowed to brag about the mistakes and then they make some great successes as soon as a civil servant makes a mistake? Front page of the UK, the Daily Mail. What are the terrible newspapers here? The Sun? No, what do you have? I can't remember. Anyway, no one reads papers here. So in other words, embracing that point about this is going to be difficult, not hard. What does it literally mean about organizational culture, but also crowding in other forms of finance? Because this isn't just about state-led stuff. It's about also catalyzing and having that multiplicative role. So on the back of all this, the European Commission, this is great when you are an academic and someone actually does what you tell them to do, now has these 5 mission areas. I did not choose them. These are broadly defined mission areas within which the 100 billion Horizon program, is actually less than 100 billion, they reduced it, but anyway, is trying to address at least the bit that was meant to be challenge oriented towards these mission areas. And now there's mission boards thinking about missions within some of this. And, you know, the cancer one's interesting because if that's just seen as, you know, pharmaceutical drugs or the health sector, that's not the mission in the ways that I'm talking about. So thinking just as much about preventative care, which means, of course, then eating differently, moving differently, living differently, then we start to look at these kind of intersectoral missions. I've worked a lot with countries around industrial strategy. So this is an example in the UK where I helped the government get away from the old way of thinking about their strategy and with business, where they just had a list, literally, of sectors they were going to support. At the time, they were talking about aerospace, automotive, life sciences, financial sector, and the creative industries, which are very big in the UK. So I said, well, that's kind of a random list, probably of sectors that lobbied their way up to someone in Whitehall. What would it look like to not choose random sectors, but actually be really bold with the problems? So pick the problems, these kind of mission areas, and then make sure that your industrial strategy galvanizes and helps to transform all our sectors towards, you know, the goals within them. So these were the challenges they came up with. These are mission areas like future of mobility, clean growth. And then I worked very closely with the government through a commission that I set up called the Mission Oriented Industrial Strategy Commission to help them think of missions. You probably can't read it. This is the one for future mobility. It's not that inspiring, but let me just read it. By 2040, to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and emission-free zero accident systems. So that kind of mission within the industrial strategy would require lots of different sectors, from transport, robotics, AI, urban planning. But just the fact that it had the word accessible would, of course, mean that you need a lot of innovation also in areas of disabilities. I think my time's up, so I'll be quick. What does it mean for finance? You know, there's plenty of finance out there, but it's often impatient, exit-driven finance. You know, venture capital wants to exit in 5 years. This is why it's actually problematic when you have a lot of venture capital in science-based sectors, whether it's fusion or biotech. In the biotech sector, we've ended up with lots of PLIPOs, productless IPOs, because of the rush to issue an initial public offering or to buy out, which rushed the science. So in some ways, the Human Genome Project was rushed and didn't actually fulfill its true potential. We're seeing this in a lot of different science-based sectors. So we need patient, long-term, committed finance to also help those companies that are willing. So it's not about picking winners, picking the willing. We're willing to work with governments around really kind of difficult challenges. And we know globally that public banks, public funds, like development finance institutions, are quite important for this. But if they're just handing out money to companies that want to get bailed out, they become part of the problem. So creating a mission-oriented public bank is quite a different way to design such a bank. So I helped the Scottish government do that. Let me just speed up a bit. In Sweden, what's been interesting is they have a very high-level challenge, which is to create a fossil-free welfare state. And then it lands on all sorts of different areas that the state works in, like public education, public transport. And in public education, they have thought about school meals, so lunches, as having to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. And that has then driven how they procure in those school meal production across the whole value chain, but also to get kids involved in both the design of the meals, but also learning about it through the curriculum. And that participation bit is actually something I'm increasingly interested in. The work in London and Camden, I found just very informative. I currently co-chair the Camden Renewal Commission, and the Clean Growth Mission in Camden is actually nested within social housing, so the housing estates. And instead of just kind of preaching and saying, retrofit these homes, the idea was to bring people in the resident associations together very early on from these homes to just even talk and debate about what it means to actually live together more sustainably, which I think is a deep point, because even with trade unions that I mentioned in the beginning, there's a movement right now called the just transition to make sure that as we transition to a greener economy, workers and say fossil fuel-based sectors aren't left behind. That's very important, but we should also be asking, where's the labor voice ex ante helping to even design or think about, the green missions themselves. I think this will be my last slide, just to say that all this, coming back to the partnership, public-private partnership, is important. And in a moment like COVID-19, where we have so much money out there being created, in Europe, we have the Next Gen EU. Here, there's the infrastructure funds, the Build Back Better. We'll see if it actually happens. It's really important to make sure we don't waste the crisis, and embedding within the bailout programs themselves this notion that we actually want to go somewhere specific after the crisis. So build back, build forwards better isn't going to happen unless we embed within the contracts themselves, like the bailouts, some conditionality towards, mission setting. And this is all these guys look really serious in my pictures. Anyway, this is the French finance minister who made sure that Renault, the car manufacturer in France, and Air France committed to lowering their carbon emissions in the next 5 years. That was the condition to get the bailout. In most countries, including the US, but also the UK, we gave 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. So kind of embedding these conditionalities also in an area like public health, where, as I said, 40 billion a year of US taxpayer money goes into health innovation. What should be the conditions attached for a company like Pfizer to access, that pot of money? Maybe conditions including around share buybacks. Pfizer is one of the companies in the world that most uses this buyback of their own shares to boost stock prices and executive pay. Similarly, Exxon and Pfizer are two of the worst. What would it mean to not just complain about that, but to put at the center of the contracts, that public-private contract, a conditionality that relates to the kind of economy we actually want to build? This, I promise, is actually, I'm going to force myself to stop the last slide, which in the last chapter of the book, I kind of pause and go back to the beginning and say, if bad theory got us bad practice, what is then a better theory that we actually need to get this kind of mission-oriented practice, putting purpose at the center? And I kind of go through big words, value is collectively created, markets as shaped, not just fixed, those really important dynamic capabilities we need in all organizations, not just the private sector, and the decimation of those capabilities that we have witnessed with the infantilization of government capacity, tools, whether it's budgeting or procurement, as outcomes focused, inequality tackled in a pre-distributive, not just a redistributive way, getting the conditions right in the first place. Doing that through also building more symbiotic partnerships, not these kind of parasitic ones that we've seen in some sectors. And this issue of participation, which I mentioned in the end with the Camden and the Swedish model, I do think is really, really important, especially in an era of such extreme polarization that we have, whether it's Trump's America, Brexit, England, anti-vax, Ottawa, and so on. There's something about making sure this isn't just preaching by the elite, but truly a participatory and open process. And thank you.